Good afternoon. On behalf of the Center for Community Progress, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar. My name is Julia Zimmerman, and I serve as the Events Coordinator for National Leadership in Education here at Community Progress. Community Progress webinars equip participants with the building blocks to understand and solve tough challenges related to property vacancy, abandonment, and deterioration. For today's webinar, we are joined by Odetta McLeish-White and Zachary Murray. Odetta McLeish-White is the Director of Georgia Initiatives for the Center for Community Progress. Over her 20-year career, McLeish-White has worked in affordable housing development, policy, and financing. Most recently, she served as the Managing Director of the Transformation Alliance, a partnership of nonprofits, government agencies, and businesses working to strengthen communities through transit in Metro Atlanta. Today, McLeish-White leverages her broad community development experience and a justice-centered framework to help meet the needs of residents, localities, and industry leaders who are partnering to fight property vacancy and deterioration in Georgia. Zachary Murray is the Organizing and Movement Building Director at the Guild, where he leads advocacy and community engagement efforts to expand support for community ownership in Atlanta. Prior to his work at the Guild, he led Up South, Down South Community Development, a consulting practice that provided capacity building, leadership development, and technical assistance for new and emerging community land trust efforts. A graduate of Cornell University, Murray's passion for community development and justice using race and place as a lens is inspired by his upbringing in Baltimore, Maryland. Before turning it over to our speakers, I want to mention that we will allow time at the end of the presentation to answer questions. If you have a question during the presentation, please click the Stage tab on the right of your screen, select Chat, and type your question into the chat box. We will share presentation slides and a video recording of today's presentation in the week following. If you experience any technical difficulties, please send an email to Julia Zimmerman at jzimmerman@communityprogress.org. And with that, I'll turn it over to Odetta.
Yay! Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for that great introduction, Julia. I'm loving seeing the wide range of folks that are joining our webinar today from all across the country. Welcome to everyone. As Julia has said, my name is Odetta McLeish-White, and I'm so excited to provide this platform to the Guild and to Zach Murray. Center for Community Progress's mission of turning vacant, abandoned, and deteriorating properties into assets for neighborhoods is beautifully lived out by the Guild's organizational values and focus. And you're going to see that today in Zach's presentation of the 918 Dill Avenue project. I personally have worked with the Guild in a number of ways for just about 5 years now, and their commitment to racial equity, non-extractive development processes, and community wealth building and investment in power are always inspiring to me. So I want to go straight into letting you see this great project, hear from the brilliance that is Zach Murray, and I look forward to great questions and conversation at the end of his presentation. So Zach, I turn the floor over to you.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks to Odetta and the team from Center for Community Progress for the invitation to speak with you all today about our exciting work at the Guild. The Guild's mission is to build community wealth and power through community-owned real estate, entrepreneurship programs, and access to capital for Black and other communities of color. And so we'll jump into some more about what we do and then talk about the 918 project specifically this afternoon. All right, you can go to the next slide, please. So just to give you a little bit more about where we'll go today, we'll talk a little bit about what we do as an organization, why we exist, the problems that we aim to tackle, some of our history and values, a little bit about our team, and then jump into information about the 918 Dill project, which is a pilot of our Groundcover initiative and a community stewardship trust. And then we'll close out with some resources and contact info. Next slide. So about our team, you can go to the next slide as well. We are a place-based community wealth building organization that is focused on building regional solidarity in the U.S. South, in the Southern economy, through community-owned real estate, entrepreneurship programs, and access to capital for BIPOC communities. And so we do this in a few ways. The first is through development. We aim to build affordable mixed-use housing and commercial retail spaces for long-term community members, entrepreneurs, artists, and activists. These development projects are all aimed to be community ownership initiatives. And so we create community-owned, community-governed, mixed-use real estate models via a structure that we call the Community Stewardship Trust, which we'll jump into a bit later. We also do ecosystem organizing. And so we work with other community-based organizations, movement groups, to transform the economic and political landscape. We also offer entrepreneurship programs. And so we work with small businesses, with small developers and social enterprises to help them boost their profitability and sustainability. And finally, we're leading an integrated capital fund. Our fund is called Groundcover, and it uses integrated non-extractive capital to invest in scaling up our model of community-owned real estate that creates a pathway to ownership for Black and Brown people. Next slide, please. And so in short, why we exist is that we know that there are a lot of problems in our existing real estate market. And so we and our work emerges as a direct response to racism and the capitalist notion of ownership, which from the roots of this country has led to the exclusion of people of color, involving the theft of indigenous people's land, involving slavery, and then the transition to racist housing covenants, to redlining, urban renewal, highway construction, and the undervaluing of Black homes and assets. And so property ownership is rooted in a lot of racism, exclusion, and exploitation, specifically of communities of color. And that has resulted in structural racism that has reproduced a lot of inequalities, such as the racial wealth gap. We know that that home ownership is one of the major mechanisms for building wealth in this country. And unfortunately, because people of color have higher rates of poverty, there's a huge gap in home ownership in this country that expands the racial wealth gap. And there, as a result of higher rates of poverty and so on, there's also gaps in access to credit, capital, and economic mobility for communities of color. Next slide, please. And we know also that the racial wealth gap is unfortunately widening, and real estate is a primary vehicle through which we see this happening. And so there's persistent systemic racism in access to capital, in our housing policy, in our urban development that has locked Black families out of opportunities. And so our current development trends in communities like Atlanta are accelerating gentrification and the displacement of Black communities, which is leading to a wealth erosion. In Atlanta, for example, where we see the wealth gap growing, Black-owned businesses are worth 11 times less than white-owned businesses. Among Black and Latinx households, 60% are living in asset poverty, where they have few or no assets to rely on in the event of a financial shock or crisis. Additionally, homes in majority Black zip codes are valued at $350,000 less, or almost 4 times less than homes in Black minority zip codes. And finally, Metro Atlanta has a 30% gap in rates of home ownership. So the Black home ownership rate is at about 45% versus the white home ownership rate, which is about 74%. And so this results in a massive gap in wealth in our communities that replicates racial injustice. Next slide, please. And additionally, what we recognize at the Guild is that the way that traditional real estate works doesn't actually work for most of our communities. And so in Atlanta, due to development trends like the Beltline and work from home culture, gentrification is accelerating the displacement of Black communities. We have large infrastructure projects like the Beltline that have become economic engines that benefit mostly new and higher income residents, while developers continue to build for investors rather than for existing communities. And so rents in Atlanta are among the fastest growing in the country. Rents now average $1,600 a month for a 1-bedroom and $2,080 for a 2-bedroom. Just a few years ago, the rents were about half that rate in many communities of Atlanta. And prior to the pandemic, Metro Atlanta had the 3rd highest rate of eviction in the US, and eviction rates have only worsened since the COVID-19 pandemic. I read yesterday that in the past year, there were 72,000 evictions in Metro Atlanta in the 5 counties that comprise Metro Atlanta. And in 2020, the median sales price of a home in Atlanta increased by nearly 25%, while the number of homes selling above that list price has increased by 120%. And this map just shows the intensity of evictions in the Metro Atlanta area since the COVID-19 pandemic. And those overlap with the areas that had the highest concentrations of communities of color. And so that's where we see the most intensive evictions and also the most intensive investor purchases. 1 in 3 homes in Atlanta is said to be purchased by an investor. And in some communities, that rate is as high as 90% of the homes being purchased by investors. Next slide. And so we understand also that real estate capital preserves commodities, homes as commodities, as opposed to communities, which is why we see such investor activity occurring in our communities. Both redlining and gentrification have manifest the ideas that Black communities are inherently riskier, not as valuable as white communities. And rejecting that idea means rejecting capital that forces wealth to be extracted out of these historically Black neighborhoods, which is almost all the real estate capital out there, unfortunately. And so what we understand at the Guild is that neighborhoods, not investors, but neighborhoods bear the risk of losing their homes when developments focus on profit maximization and rising property values. It's also these community members, residential tenants, commercial tenants, workers, longtime homeowners that create the value for these projects by being thoughtful stewards of the assets. It is inequitable for the returns to only accrue to the capital holders instead to all community stakeholders. And finally, we aim to shift power away from corporations and investors with no real stake in local neighborhoods and into the hands of community residents and organizations to create and love the places where they live. And so a lot of the dynamics we experience here indicate that redlining is still a major factor, and that those redline communities still experience a lot of underinvestment and are most at risk for gentrification. Next slide. So a little bit about our journey. The Guild has been around since 2015. We were founded by Nikish Iyengar, our founder and chief ecosystem director. And so we started as a program at Eastlake Commons, which was a residential co-housing community focused on holistic entrepreneurship and development. And we expanded from there at Eastlake Commons. We went to a property on 340 Auburn Avenue, which was a mixed-use development in the historic Black Sweet Auburn corridor, where we led a co-housing community that was centered on revitalization without displacement. We then, in 2019, launched our Community Wealth Building Accelerator and the Transform Finance Institute, and began to lead, once that development on Sweet Auburn was completed, co-retail event and office space in the Sweet Auburn community alongside a Black-led Community Development Corporation. By 2020, we saw the need to shift into creating community-owned real estate assets. And so we were able to acquire our first property, which we'll talk about today, 918 Dill, in Atlanta's Capitol View neighborhood, to pilot our first community-owned mixed-use development in Atlanta. And then we, in 2021, began a collaboration with an organization called Community Movement Builders, which is the basis for our second pilot project on Ira Street in Atlanta's Pittsburgh neighborhood. And in 2022, we launched our and designed our Groundcover pilot project of $10 million to scale our development operations. Okay, we can move to the next slide, please. So a little bit about our development principles, what we choose to act on as our development ethos. The first is we promote permanent affordability and decommodifying of housing, because we believe that housing is a human right and not a commodity for maximizing profits. So our model removes real estate from the speculative market to ensure it's permanently affordable in the long term. Next is local control. We believe that neighborhoods should be governed and controlled by people with the most vested interest in them, those who live there. And that we should prevent people from being put at risk of displacement. And finally, our third principle is community wealth building, is that rather than maximizing individual profits, we as a development entity are focused on maximizing community well-being and democratic control. And so this involves the residents buying back the block together through partnership, power, and community building. Next slide. So this is our team, our founder and ecosystem director, Nikish Iyengar, Danny Brockington, who's our second staff person and director of storytelling engagement, Avery Ebron, our director of community products, and Antresh Tandon, the director of design and development. We are a 100% BIPOC worker-owned cooperative, which is really exciting. We formally became a cooperative last year. Next slide, please. All right, so I just want to give a bit of an overview about Groundcover, which is the fund that we developed in order to help acquire properties and to develop properties. And so, in the ecosystem, Groundcover forms a layer of vegetation below the shrub layer that provides protection of the topsoil from erosion and drought. And so that term is really a metaphor for the role that we see ourselves playing in communities, that across the country, communities of color act as rich ground cover, bolstering local economies through small businesses, adding to cultural vibrancy, and strengthening democracy by organizing for racial justice and equity. Gentrification and systemic racism are factors that erode this rich ground cover away. And communities of color continue to be disproportionately displaced and economically marginalized. At the heart of these compounding capitalist-fueled crises is the issue of prioritizing profits over people. And so in order to repair and restore this rich ground cover, we believe it is necessary to invest in alternate development models that prevent community erosion and build community wealth. And so our ground cover project involves community stewardship, democratizing capital, making it accessible to all people, and racial justice and equity. Next slide, please. And so onto our 918 Dill Avenue project. This is the Guild's first development in the Capitol View community in Southwest Atlanta. And this project is going to feature 18 units of permanently affordable housing that will be built on top of 7,150 square feet of existing retail space. And so again, it's located in the Capitol View community and will be the city's first community-owned and governed mixed-use space. And so the building's retail space is also going to include a grocery store and 3 commercial kitchen spaces for local food businesses that will help address the local food apartheid dynamic that Capitol View has been experiencing for the past 30 years, in which there are no grocery stores and not a lot of fresh food businesses. And a number of the businesses that will be sharing the commercial kitchen space are groups that went through some of the Guild's programming. And so they will now have permanent space in which to help their business expand, and will also be able to vend their foods out of the grocery store. One of the important features of the 918 Dill Avenue project is that local residents are going to be able to buy shares of ownership in the property, becoming members of what we've coined as the Community Stewardship Trust, or CST. That will enable residents to collectively own and steward the spaces and benefit from the upside of development. And so as the equity on the project increases from the improvements and the changes that are occurring in the neighborhood, the residents will be able to benefit from the rise in equity by buying back the equity in the project. And so the 21,000 square foot project has already broken ground. We broke ground in May of this year, which we're really excited about. And we will open hopefully in Q3, Q4 of 2024 at a total cost that actually has increased from 7.5 million to 9 million because of inflation and the way that our interest rates and different things have been going. And so one of the reasons why we got involved in Capitol View is because overall in the neighborhoods surrounding Capitol View, primarily in Southwest Atlanta, there are over 5,000 residents and 270 small businesses that face an extremely high risk of displacement in the coming years. And so we wanted to lead development in this area that helped to reverse that harm, both by creating permanently affordable housing and mitigating some of the risk of displacement by creating alternate mechanisms for wealth building for people in the community. Next slide, please. So I want to talk a little bit about our process and how we got to this development and all of its features. And so our process is a community-centered design process with the focus specifically on cultural preservation. And so we facilitated and co-designed sessions that bring together the residents, the small business owners, local artists, and other cultural anchors to figure out what the community needs are. And our pilot project involves, 918 Dill, and also involves an open space lot across the street that we are currently in the process of reclaiming as a community effort. And so we're working with multiple neighborhood organizations to activate that space during warm weather months and coordinating neighborhood builds of seating furniture and safety barriers from recycled materials. Specifically at 918 Dill, again, right across the street from that open lot, the exterior walls of the building served as an ongoing site for imagining what could be there, as residents were invited to share their visions for the space as it developed. We also partnered with the Community Association, the Capitol View Neighborhood Association, to hold design sessions to be open-ended in those charrettes about what the community needed. And that's how we actually reached the conclusion of opening a grocery store on site, was because the community felt that that was a really critical need for fresh food in the community, which had lacked it for many, many years. Next slide, please. And so this project has involved a really amazing ecosystem of different players and funders to help make it possible. And that's part of what the Guild aims to do in any development, is to help activate a powerful ecosystem that can be accessed by communities who otherwise might lack access to the ability to develop. And so specifically on 918 Dill, because it's our first time developing, we entered a co-development partnership with an experienced Black-owned firm called Urban Oasis Development, who are our co-developers on the project. We're also utilizing a Black-owned general contractor, Ujamaa Construction. We're currently in the process of securing our final construction loan and some grants. We were working through LISC and are now working through the reinvestment fund to secure that final capital. And we also received capital from the Spark Initiative. Since that time, again, we partnered with Community Movement Builders, which is a grassroots organizing collective in a neighboring neighborhood called Pittsburgh, and are beginning the plans for the second pilot project on Ira Street in that Pittsburgh community. Additionally, just this past month, we closed on a third pilot project, a single family home in the Peoplestown community of Atlanta. And we're partnering with an organization called the Housing Justice League to help them incubate a community land trust that is known as the People's Land Trust. And so that single family home will house a resident who was displaced from her home of 27 years. And she'll be able to purchase this home and to make it a permanently affordable home to the community. In addition, her home sits on a half acre. And so the goal is to build additional units that could house and be home ownership opportunities for members of the Housing Justice League's base. And so we received a very generous grant from the Catali Foundation, which helped to bolster our model of the Community Stewardship Trust and the Groundcover Fund, which I'll talk a little bit more about in the coming slides. We can go to the next slide. All right. So to talk about the Community Stewardship Trust, which is the mechanism that enables the community to buy into the 918 Dill project, basically what it involves is the Guild closes on a property and puts in place various ecosystem level partnerships, as we talked about in the last slide, to ensure the project's success, that it can successfully be developed, doesn't just sit vacant and contributing to some of the blight issues in a community. The Guild raises mission-aligned financing and works on construction, which we're currently in the process of doing now at 918 Dill. And in parallel, we work with partners on community organizing and investor education. And so right now, we're going door to door in the Capitol View neighborhood and in other neighborhoods of the zip code in Southwest Atlanta to inform people about the opportunity and to get them involved in education sessions that will inform them about the benefits of the CST and some of the goals of the CST. And next, the Community Stewardship Trust, CST formation, works with the community on tenant lease up. And so CST and open the community to begin investing. And those same investors will help us in terms of getting the word out about available units, about available commercial space. And then the residents, after the launch of the building, buy shares of the CST and become community investors with voting rights in a democratically governed body. And are basically buying back equity in the project. And so tenants will pay the rent, and that in turn allows the property to pay down debt. And once the debt is paid down and the equity in the project increases, we're then able to pay out dividends based on the shares, as the shares appreciate, based on the rise in property value. And so the ownership of a mixed-use property, once all the shares are purchased out, is then transferred from the Guild to the community. And so we invite local residents to buy shares anywhere from $10 to $100 a month in the property trust. And in return, they receive voting rights, one person, one vote, as well as annual dividend and investment appreciation opportunities. Next slide. And so this CST is open to members of the entire zip code. And so you don't have to just be a resident in the building. We're also inviting everyone in the 30310 zip code to participate in purchasing shares. And so it has an amplified benefit to the neighborhood overall. And so again, those community residents buy shares, become investors in the property with voting rights and equity. It's a low dollar investment in order to make it accessible to low income communities. Additionally, investors gain short-term returns through annual dividends based off of the net operating profits of the property. And then long-term returns flow to investors, much like a savings account would. And so the CST also includes protection from loss because, real estate is inherently risky, but we have a fund that protects our low-income investors so that they're not at all at risk of losing the money that they put in. And we provide investor and communal governance education and membership in local democratic governing bodies to the members of our board. And it's also an SEC compliant portal for investors. And so this chart just kind of demonstrates how we see the community stewardship working in terms of the transfer of property ownership to the community over a 10-year period. And so we have a bulk of lender equity that we have to pay back, which the rents will help to pay back. And as that equity is being paid down by the rents on the property, the community equity pool becomes larger because of the more investors that we're able to get in the project. So that at some point when there's no more equity or lender debt left, that the property will be completely owned by the community in terms of the equity that they've purchased. Next slide, please. So just a little bit about our Groundcover fund. We are launching a $10 million pilot fund, which we have officially begun the campaign for, to get our communities to a critical mass and momentum for collective and community ownership. We see this as a movement that is really critical at this time, especially, but we understand that the deal by deal approach, like our pilot project, is not sufficient given how long the investment durations are and how difficult it is to try to match non-extractive sources of capital to our uses. And so our belief is that when properties do come on the market, we will have access to rapid capital to be able to quickly move those properties off the speculative market and to purchase them in order to turn them over to communal ownership and stewardship. And sometimes it's clear that even when our communities are sufficiently organized, and this has been a challenge on the Dill project, we're able to acquire the properties, and we're bringing in the skilled teams to develop these assets. These projects are often too small for tax credits, certainly, but also for investors, banks, or CDFIs. We know that there are challenges in terms of the capital that's accessible at CDFIs, and that the interest rates are often higher. And so our Groundcover project, basic pilot project, aims to find about 5 other pilots that we can quickly invest in to test this thesis out. And so we're raising this tranche of capital in order to enable that. We're already 3 projects in. I just discussed those 3 projects with you. And so, we're basically launching this in order to more rapidly fund and develop these properties. And so in building Groundcover's current pilot, we're also developing toolkits and other resources that we share out with communities to help democratize the learning and experimentation that we're doing in these forms of development, because we don't seek to be gatekeepers, but to help open gates to communities. And so again, Groundcover's mission is to scale community-owned and community-controlled real estate models and create a pathway to self-determination for marginalized communities. Next slide, please. And so these are just some of the objectives involved in our work of developing the CST and the fund, is that we're creating opportunity overall through increasing the supply of permanently affordable housing available to residents in the zip code, developing commercial space that's also affordable and meets the needs of local residents, entrepreneurs, and organizations, creating a model for collective ownership and governance as a path to self-determination, and developing an accessible and sustainable community wealth building vehicle, which the CST aims to do. Each of our 18 permanently affordable units will be available to 60 to 80% AMI, which is where our funding subsidy enables us to go to. However, there are a number of units that will be covered by project-based Section 8 vouchers. And we do also intend to accept Section 8 in the other units as well. Additionally, we are working to launch the grocery store, the commercial kitchen space in this development project, and ensure that the property is governed by long-term legacy residents in the neighborhood. From there, we can actually move to the next slide. So I just wanted to share a video with you all really quickly before we close out, which is it covers our groundbreaking and talks a little bit about how we see power building in the work that we're doing at 918 Dill. So if you all can pull that video up, that would be great.
When we talk about power building at the Guild, what we mean is that
for a long time, real estate, our neighborhood development, community development has been out of the hands of people. Did it freeze? Looks like it may have frozen up there, but that's okay. I can share a link in the chat as well if folks want to check out that video. So yeah, I think I'll close it out there and just share, open up to any questions or comments that folks have.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Zach. I always love hearing about the work that you're doing in the Guild. Julia, did you want to take one more run at the video, or will we just work with the link and send that around to folks? Sorry, hon, you're on mute.
Oops, my bad. I think let's just send the link around. I think it might be my Wi-Fi acting up a little bit.
Okay,
Yeah,
no worries. So Zach, we've definitely got the questions coming in, and it looks like we had a great little community moment. Mercedes had a question about where Capitol View is, and it was answered for her. But was there anything else you wanted to share about the neighborhood, a little bit about its history? It's a historically Black neighborhood for sure, but any other sort of features or history about Capitol View in particular?
Yeah, I mean, Capitol View, as you mentioned, is a historically Black neighborhood. It has sort of underwent the transition with white flight, beginning in the 50s, and is in a corridor of the city, kind of generally known as the West End, which is really in close proximity to Spelman, Morehouse, Clark Atlanta, the Atlanta University Center. And so there's always been a real strong cultural connection to those universities. It's also, in a part of town that sort of has lacked a lot of major investment over the years from city government. But in recent times, there have been a number of younger homeowners who have moved into the community and have really worked to activate the neighborhood. It's in very close proximity, about a half a mile or so to a mile away from Atlanta's Beltline. And so it's receiving a lot of the spillover impact. In fact, there are hundreds of housing units, probably nearly 1,000 housing units that are being planned for development in the neighborhood immediately surrounding Capitol View. One other important feature, kind of a rare feature for Atlanta, is that Capitol View is also a transit-oriented neighborhood. It's really, really close to the Oakland City MARTA station, about just a half a mile and a few blocks in some cases in Capitol View away from that. So that's a major, selling point for development right now in the area, but also one that, we're hoping to help both take advantage of, but mitigate some of the risk that often comes with being in close proximity to transportation.
Sure, transit amenities like a MARTA station and certainly the Beltline activate markets massively. I think everyone in Atlanta was really taken by surprise at how quickly the Beltline shifted market values and started moving people around. How about, do you know about the schools in Capitol View? You've talked about the higher ed proximity, but it's also a neighborhood that has historically had a school and generationally educated Black residents.
Yeah, there's Sylvan Middle School, and I'm slipping on the name of the elementary school that's immediately located in the neighborhood. They're all part of the Carver cluster in Atlanta. And so, those are areas where we've also been doing outreach to get in touch with parents, to inform them about the CST, to get in touch with the school, to inform them about the opportunities that are available, to invest right in the community and to make that something that can help build an asset for families who live right in the community.
That's great. We have a few questions that sort of fall in the vein of the CST. The first one I think you answered in your presentation, which is Marty wanted to know, can only residents in the project buy shares? And you indicated that if you're in a certain zip code, you can buy into the CST, right?
Yeah, that's right. So
there.
Yeah, it's open to folks in the 30310 zip code generally. So it doesn't just apply only to the residents of the project.
In a similar vein, I have two others. I'm going to start with Gabriel and then go to Colin. But Gabriel was wondering, fairly enough, is there something in the design of the CST to prevent investor entities from kind of finding a way to get a control and taking over? How do you protect the ground cover?
Absolutely. So this isn't open to corporate investors. It's only open to community residents. And so we work very intentionally to recruit from folks among the community. The other important thing is that even if you buy a ton of shares, it's still one person, one vote. And so it doesn't enable one person to buy out a much larger stake and then have outsized decision-making power. It's a very democratic system in which no matter how much equity you buy into the project, you still have the same decision-making power as somebody who maybe has less equity than you. And that's one of the ways that we are hoping to subvert, the sort of, corporate mechanisms for taking control of properties like this, putting them at risk of, moving into the speculative market.
And what kind of proof of residency are you requiring?
Yeah, I mean, we'll need like address information so that we can send out, whatever mailings or different things like that. But our aim is to be in deep engagement with the community, and so we're getting to know the community residents as we're recruiting and educating about this. And so, it's a deep form of community engagement that we're conducting. And so, we want to know where folks live. We want to know how folks are living and how we can help to create stability in the community and help bolster the community, especially of our long-term legacy residents who might be at risk of displacement.
Right. Colin then does wonder, how does this model different from the community investment trust model?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we actually are drawing on the community investment trust model of Mercy Corps and also the legacy of community land trusts as well to build out our model. I think one of the ways that it's different is that, to my understanding, Mercy Corps has mostly invested in commercial properties, where this involves investment in mixed use and also just residential properties. And so it's a bit different in that way. And also the build out of our CST in terms of the emphasis on securing the investment of low income investors, ensuring that they don't experience loss in the event that should occur. And also the sort of differences, there's some differences in the way the model was built out specifically that help it to be more accessible to the community that we intend to serve. But it absolutely draws from, and we've learned from Mercy Corps along the way.
Fantastic. Shi Wei, I hope I pronounced that correctly, is wondering if the $10 million cost, is that to match the pilot project cost, or how'd you come up with that 10 million?
Yeah, so actually the Groundcover fundraising project that I forgot to update the slides. We're actually raising a larger amount, a pool of money at this point. I believe somewhere between $15 to $17 million. And it isn't aiming to, part of it is aiming to cover some of the gap due to the rising construction costs, about $1 million or so, $1.5 million that we aim to raise to help cover that on the Dill project. But really what the goal is to help us to quickly incubate other development initiatives. So we mentioned the pilot project with CMB on Irish Street in Pittsburgh. We mentioned
that was Community Movement Builders. Sorry, CMB.
Right. Yep. We mentioned the project that we're doing now to help incubate a community land trust with the Housing Justice League. And so basically, we want to have a rapid pool of capital that we can move to quickly acquire properties from. And that's sort of the aim of the Groundcover Fund.
I see some folks already asking, how can we help? And if you have access to funds and want to invest in the Groundcover Fund, I think that's one thing you should look into for sure. Ashish would like to know, is there a mechanism or strategy that precludes members of the community from basically, releasing kind of I guess that's sort of a flip opportunity and sort of then voting to sell the property and kind of trying to push a more capitalistic, profit-driven outcome?
That's a great question. We're actually working on the sort of legal mechanism for that. I think what it will ultimately resemble, very similar to the community land trusts, is a deed restriction that sort of requires, as a part of ownership of the property, that you maintain the affordability. And I think that's probably the safest legal mechanism for us to employ in order to prevent that from happening. But we're also committed to conducting education with the investors over the long term to impart in them, why we see this affordability as such an important benefit, both to them personally, but also to the community as a whole. And so that's a part of it, is that we want to help inspire an ethos in people that this isn't just a flip, right? This is a long-term investment opportunity to help stabilize community and to help provide access and opportunity to our communities.
Got it. I'm going to pluck a question that I think stays in this vein a little bit. Also from Ashish, is there an income limit for investors?
Yeah, we haven't decided that. We're going to launch the CST formally when the project opens. We didn't want to have it be collecting money before there's anything people can actually see and experience. And so one of our thoughts is that we would have solidarity investors who may be higher income folks who are willing to part with their dividend or don't have the same requirements around receiving the equity, and that could be put aside for folks who really need this as a wealth building strategy. And so that's still very much up in the air. But our aim is definitely to target this mostly at lower income folks of low assets, as an alternate tool for being able to build something like that.
Great. I'm going to go back up to the top. We've got like 16 questions. So you're generating so much thought. Winnie asks, how will the long-term resident leaders for governance be selected or elected? What is the governance model?
Yeah, again, we're still in the process of developing that. We want to do that somewhat through conversations with the community, but I imagine how it will happen is through a vote of all of the investors. Again, one person, one vote. And so folks would send out information about why they want to be a part of the board, and then can be selected among the pool of investors who would get an opportunity to vote.
Happily, there are several folks, including the next question, that want to know, how can we help? How can we collaborate? Let's save that one to maybe try and close out. So that's the last thing that folks hear. Is there any collaboration with the local NPUs, neighborhood planning units?
So in order to get a development of this type through, we have to be in conversation with our NPUs. And so NPUX, we have meetings with them, really beginning with the Capitol View Neighborhood Association that then funnels up to the NPU, Neighborhood Planning Unit. And so we've been in regular conversation to provide updates to them and the Capitol View Neighborhood Association about the project. One of the challenges with this project has been the rise in construction costs that we experience, and all types of developments have been experiencing the rising interest rate environment. And so that delayed our project. And so we had to be very much in regular conversation with them. We get information about when there's dumping happening on site, or when there's been graffiti put up, and we want to basically be effective stewards of the neighborhood. And so that has to involve conversation with both the NPU and the neighborhood associations.
Awesome. Jeremy asks, based on the pro forma for Dill Avenue and the investment from resident shares, have you been able to project the annual dividends returned to your investors?
I'm not probably the person to answer that question, unfortunately. Our development director, Andres, has been working very diligently on that, and he probably has the answer. I'm going to say I'm not certain what the annual dividends are, but I think it probably has been projected, because we do know what the rents are going to cover in terms of servicing the loans and things like that. But I'm not sure what the dollar amount is yet.
Sure. Miguel wonders, how do you determine what you consider to be affordable housing?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really important question. I always say affordable for whom, right? Because we know that the majority of the need for affordable housing is at or below 30% AMI, 50% AMI. Unfortunately, with this project, we weren't able to achieve that through the different subsidies. A lot of the subsidies that are available, we have great partners in Invest Atlanta, in other groups, but they don't go to the depths of affordability that are needed in this market, which again is at or below 50% AMI. However, we are accepting, and I believe 3 of the units, project-based vouchers from the Housing Authority. And so we believe that'll get to those low and extremely low income households. And we're also willing and hoping to accept market, Section 8 vouchers, the vouchers that households hold on this project, so that we can get to those lower income households. But through, working out our pro forma, through the amount of subsidy that we were able to achieve and the loan that we were able to service, we had to hold the rents at 60 to 80% AMI, although we definitely intended to go lower. And on the other two projects, the Irish Street project and the Land Trust project, we are serving at or below 50% AMI on both of those projects.
That's great. Any thoughts around connecting this work to small business incubation, worker co-op, business development as part of this work in Capitol View?
Absolutely. And so, as I mentioned, I believe two of the businesses that'll be renting out the commercial kitchens are groups that went through the Guild's business incubator programs. And so, we've been working to develop an ecosystem to help support small businesses, specifically businesses that are owned by people of color. And so, this project is an extension of that work and will provide a long-term opportunity for those food businesses to expand. But I didn't mention that in addition to the ground floor grocery space, that we're also opening a sort of community workspace called the Futures Lab that'll be on the back part of the commercial space. And so that will be a space for small business, co-op incubation, community organizations to utilize to help different businesses begin to just have space to function and to thrive and to come together for workshops and trainings and things like that. And so that's very much a part of our goal, specifically in this space, is to help support that larger ecosystem of small businesses and co-ops.
I see a few questions that relate to the grocery store, so I'll kind of try and ask those together. The first question was, what research have you done in bringing in a grocery store? Are you seeking a local venture or a brand name company? And also, will there be a way to control prices within the grocery store considering the market?
Yeah, these are all things that we're working on now as we develop out the model for the grocery store. It's a very tough environment for grocery retail, especially small grocery retail. And so we're learning a lot from our existing grocery partners. Our aim is that it's going to be a small, locally owned grocery store. And so we're learning a lot from the West End grocery store. We're learning a lot from Carver Market here in Atlanta and opening up conversations with some of the existing retailers that are in the same model size that we are about what the best practices are and how we should go about this. But our aim is to provide local produce, to source locally, to source food locally for the community. And so it's something that we're learning as we go along. We're in conversation now with a bunch of different smaller businesses that may have an interest in this space, but we're not looking at creating space for a Trader Joe's or Aldi or anything like that. We really want it to be something that's locally owned for the community.
Great. I'm going to sort of combine a couple questions because someone's curious about how you came across Dill Avenue, but also how do you know that you've reached a good amount of community engagement, right? If it's sort of a more sparsely populated neighborhood. So how do you determine that you've had enough community engagement or community input? So how did you find the specific building, and then how do you know when you have sort of touched enough people to feel like it's time to move forward with that thing?
Yeah. So we found the 918 Dill project, the property, through conversation with residents in Capitol View who had been attempting to purchase the building for years. And so the building had sat vacant and dormant for a number of years. And folks who have moved into the community, who have lived in the community for a long time, wanted to see something done. And they said, well, that would probably be better off in our community's hands than just sitting there languishing or having somebody come in who maybe doesn't have the same ethos as we do as a community. And so Nikishka specifically was in conversation with folks in the Capitol View community and said, I think we can do something about this. And so we went out to go source that non-extractive friendly capital, and we're able to make it happen. And it became a really important pilot project, a demonstration project of how this can happen in communities across Atlanta and really across the country. In terms of community engagement's never complete. I also serve as a chair of my local neighborhood association here in Atlanta. I saw Layla Rue on the call. Great to see you. We know that we're just a small fraction, community associations, of who actually lives in the neighborhood. And so it's never complete, but we, on the activation lot across the street, host a number of different events that welcome different community groups that basically always try to open up a conversation with different audiences in different spaces about the opportunity here. And we see the CST, as a long-term engagement opportunity as well. And so, my opinion is that you're never, ever complete in terms of community engagement. It's just most important to have, open ears and an open mind in terms of dealing with community. We also, because this is an ongoing development, receive regular feedback, sometimes critique from folk in the community about our progress. We've delayed the project because of financing a couple of times. The construction is always a messy process, and so folks have not been satisfied with some of the ways the contractors have operated. And so these are all things that we take in and we process and we help create a solution to and make sure the community is satisfied and content with the type of neighbor that we're being.
I'm going to sort of tag on a Kay's question here about educating people. We've all been so ingrained in sort of capitalist perspectives. That kind of ongoing conversation that you just described is also, it seems to me, a mechanism for passing along, here's why we're different, and here's how you might think about this. Is that one of the ways that you're helping to educate folks in the neighborhood about what is this CST thing anyway?
Absolutely. I mean, so many of us are fixated because this is just the dominant notion on the idea of flipping a home, right? And flipping a property or becoming a real estate investor so that I can quickly make, a good sum of money and move on to the next place. And so, we have to kind of unwire to some extent that thinking as it relates to this project, right? Because that's not the intent of this. And to show people, the meaning of what we're doing. We're learning from groups such as VOLAR, VOLAR, in Village of Love and Resistance in Baltimore, who I think have done a lot of really great work at supporting the type of political education that helps connect communities to this concept of community ownership. And so it's a learning process for us because we don't want to approach this arrogantly because we know that people have needs and that people should benefit from the real estate market when they have the opportunity to, right? That's not something but we know that this aims to be different than the dominant way the real estate market functions. And that if we can continue to spread this out more, that maybe that helps to expand equity as it relates to community development.
So I see we're coming kind of into the home stretch, and I definitely want to leave at least a minute or two for you to talk about ways people can engage, learn more, and help in the work. So forgive me, folks. I'm going to pluck a few that I hope Zach can answer relatively quickly. And then maybe Julia can let us know some ways that if you didn't get your question answered, we can make sure that maybe Zach sees that and we can find a way to get you what you're looking for. But quickly, Carolina wonders, how will the community fund address maintenance challenges over time?
Yeah, the community fund in terms of the CST.
Yeah, let's go with that.
Yeah, so basically it's all sort of baked into the pro forma so that there's a reserve fund that will manage any type of maintenance issues that arise over time, because we know that happens on large properties. The AC wears out, or there's a problem, a new window needs to be replaced, or a unit has to be repaired. That's all built into a reserve fund for the property, so that we're not putting the investors at risk of having to make a massive external investment to replace an elevator, for example. We know those are things that are out of hand of their skill set and their experience. And so the guild will be involved long-term in the management of the property.
Can the shares that are purchased be inherited? Is this a form of generational wealth?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So that's one of our aims, is that residents can pass this on, as an asset that, is long-term for their families.
I see from Antonia and Miguel that there were questions about preserving small business and definition of permanently affordable housing. I think we touched at least briefly on those, but Antonia or Miguel, if that didn't go deep enough, we'll find ways to maybe advance the conversation a little more. Hans wonders if there's IP wrapped around your CST business model for expansion nationally and internationally. And what other steps could be taken to ensure local community affordability. And after you answer this one, Zach, let's go to that question of like how to stay in touch and how to help you with this work. Great. And then I think Julia will be ready to take us out.
Great. Yeah. So, I think we at the Guild believe that the movement is open source, right? And so we're hoping that just like we borrowed and learned from the work that Mercy Corps was doing, that other groups will do the same. And we're certainly available to work with and to consult with groups who are interested in bringing this model to their community. I know our aim is to help expand this model across the U.S. South. where we feel that this is really, really necessary. And oftentimes those communities are underrepresented in a lot of conversations and access to opportunities. And so, I think that's kind of where we are is wanting the model to expand as communities see fit, but not in a space where we feel that we own this and that this is our thing because, we're learning, from the CLTs to the CIT, it's all sort of open source in my opinion. And that's how we're going to be able to build the momentum that gets this movement to a place where we think it needs to be.
Awesome.
And so in terms of how to support or how to learn more, we are actually in the process of doing various funder briefings for our Groundcover fund. And so those involve walking, folks who are interested in potentially investing in grants or loans into the fund through our model and, being able to communicate with them how it works and what our expectations are and how that might match up with whatever funds people have access to or have available. And so you can email me. I think I put my contact in one of the slides. I can also share that in the chat to find out more information about the funder briefings. And also if you're interested in learning more about the CST model or about any of the work that we're doing, very open to you all following up through email contact. And if there was a question that I wasn't able to answer, like about the appreciation on the dividend, I can put you in contact with someone in our staff who can answer it better than I can.
That's great. Julia, I'm also not sure if questions are compiled and are able to be sent out and answered later, but take us on out, and thank you so much, Zach. You're always inspiring.
Awesome. Thank you, Odetta.
Yeah, for sure. So we're going to be sending out a follow-up email within the next 7 days. That'll include Zach and Odetta's emails. I will pull out the questions from the chat and I'll shoot them over to an email. Wow, to you, Odetta and Zach. And maybe we'll gather some follow-up resources that we'll include in that follow-up email that will go out to all registrants. We're going to be dropping a link to a survey in the chat in just a second. And if people can fill that out, we'd really appreciate it. And please just be sure to visit our website, communityprogress.org, and join our listserv to stay up to date with any new webinar announcements. Thanks so much.
Awesome. Thank you all.
Thanks.